Okay, everyone can hear me okay? No? I'm seeing a head shaking. Uh-oh. Should I do this?
Oh, do we need to be like really...
Is this better? Okay. All right, I will project. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Books, Booze, and Brains. I believe this is season 9, episode 3. In case you were expecting Krista, just an announcement that Allison Essex and I, both graduate students, well, I was previously a graduate student at IU School of Medicine, have taken over for this season. And so next month's book is The Perfect Predator by Stephanie Strathdy, and that will be on Zoom, and that will be Allison Essex leading. And also, hello to the live stream. We're also live streaming. The link is on the Indiana Sciences Twitter page, if anyone wants to share. And so I just want to start by thanking some of the people and the organizations that have made this possible today. Thank you to our partners at Central Indiana Science Outreach, CIMSO, Indiana Sciences, Indiana Humanities, Indiana Public Library, and Blackacre, obviously, for letting us use their space today, giving us beer, cocktails, the good stuff. And thank you guys for being here, and for being here in person. We really appreciate it. And finally, I want to thank Dr. Leah Milne, who is our guest expert today. And we're going to be discussing Bloodchild and Other Stories by Octavia Butler. I'm going to start with introducing our guest. So Dr. Leah Milne is an assistant professor of multicultural American literature at the University of Indianapolis. She studies contemporary ethnic American literature, specifically African American and Asian American literature, as well as post-colonial theory and women's and gender studies. So, Dr. Milne, you obviously work in a very intersectional space, so I was just wondering if you could tell us more about your work and also your connections to and studies of Octavia Butler's work. As your shirt obviously says, you've read a lot of her work, so.
Yeah, I wore my Parable of the Sower shirt today since apparently, I don't know if there's a Bloodchild shirt out there, I didn't wear it. So my work, like Jill said, is at the intersection of a lot of different topics, which is where I like to live most of the time. So when we're thinking about some of the overlaps that seem most obvious, there are definite overlaps, for example, between African American literature and post-colonial literature, which is literature that looks at people who have been formally colonized or who have experienced things like colonization. And that's true with Native American literature as well. So these are all classes that I teach at University of Indianapolis. As far as my research is concerned, I'm really interested in thinking about how literature can make the world a better place, including how it focuses on things like self-care. So it came out in July with University of Iowa Press. It's called Novel Subjects, and it focuses on different depictions of authors as characters and how we can think about writing and storytelling as a way to make our lives better. And so even though Parable of the Sower wasn't mentioned, the protagonist, Lauren Olamina, who is, this is one of the more famous books by Octavia Butler. So she is actually a writer in her own right. She writes a book that becomes the basis for a religion in the story known as Earthseed. And so the Book of Earthseed is something that she creates in order to make her own world better and to make the people that she's with interact with each other in a more ethical way. And so it's just a really good example of the kinds of things that I'm interested in when it comes to the crossover between authorship, storytelling, and multicultural literature. The first book I read by Octavia Butler is Kindred. Those of you who are into historical novels but want something a little bit more, you might want to look at Kindred because it is a historical novel. It's about a woman who finds herself in a slave plantation in Maryland, but it's also a time travel novel because that woman happens to be from the 1970s, and all of a sudden she gets thrown into this other time period. And so just a really interesting way to think about Octavia Butler and how her mind works and the kinds of things that she writes. So hopefully if you guys had a chance to read Bloodchild, you'll see all kinds of different genres and ways that she bends storytelling and themes that she's interested in. So yeah.
Sweet, thank you for sharing that. Still good? Okay. So you mentioned something about literature and the potential to change the world or change, things about the world. So I wanted to touch on that because this book has, I consider sci-fi elements to it quite a bit. And for me, at least, sci-fi has always been something that's very, it's essentially a Trojan horse, right? You have a way to include storytelling, but also include sociopolitical or socioeconomic commentary. And even with that, it's often considered something that's not as intellectual or not as academic, the sci-fi genre as its own. So I wanted to ask you, what power do you think sci-fi holds as a genre to not only impact the world, but impact its readers? And also specifically, if we can talk about Octavia Butler and what you think she aimed at with some of the stories that we read.
Yeah, I think that there's sort of a kind of rogue quality to science fiction fantasy that some people are drawn to. It's not normally seen as kind of an intellectual place to talk about literature, and yet, like you said, there are ways in which we can talk about science fiction and fantasy the same way we talk about things like post-colonial theory. Even if you look at the words that are used, right? Like, think about the concepts that you normally hear when you're watching or reading science fiction. There's first contact, right? There's discovering new planets that happen to already be occupied by other beings, right? Like, there's all these things that we see, and all the ways that language is used that suggest that these are one and the same. I'm trying to think of other, exploring new frontiers, right? Like, all this language is language of colonization and imperialism, not to be a downer here. But at the same time, it's also language that we see when we watch anything that's sci-fi, right? And so I think that overlap is kind of there on purpose, right? Because there's a way in which, especially when you're reading some of the stories here, in which you can kind of think about what Octavia Butler might have been thinking when she was writing some of these. And when we're thinking about Octavia Butler and what she might have been doing with this work, we don't have to wonder too much. There's actually boxes, I mean literal boxes of her writing and her archives and her notebooks that are at the Huntington Library. And you see in those notebooks her attempting to grapple with sometimes serious topics and sometimes just weird questions. Like, what would it be like if a man has the baby as opposed to a woman, right? And so you see her kind of using her fiction as a way to explore just interesting ideas or alternative realities. And as she says in one of her essays here, why wouldn't somebody like her, who's a woman, who's a black person, who's trying to enter the genre that is not dominated by people who look like her, right? Like, why wouldn't she want to explore other ideas and other realities? Like, it just seems kind of natural for somebody like Octavia Butler to do that. Though I want to say that it's not just, I don't think it's just political for Octavia Butler. I think she really just wants to be a writer. She wants to tell stories and she wants to make a living off of it. And so in those notebooks, the other thing you see is her just striving to get better at what she does. And so she's constantly asking herself questions that she doesn't know the answer to, and then using fiction as a way to explore them.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I was going to mention that I was just talking to someone about Near of Kin, which is one of the stories in the book, and how I had no real way to make sense of it until after I read her afterward, where she explains why she wrote that and what the concept behind it was. And it was very personal. So, it's very obvious that even though a lot of her stories are sci-fi, there's a lot of human connections, questions about humanity kind of included in that. And it comes from her lens, as you said, as a black woman who's just trying to write stories, right? Mm-hmm. All right, so thank you for that. Our next segment is a turn and talk. So essentially I'm gonna give you a little description and a question. You can turn and talk to your neighbors, form small groups, whatever you want to do. And I promised aliens today, so we're gonna talk about aliens. So in two of the short stories, and I've been told that there's an edition out there that does not have one of these stories in it. It doesn't have Amnesty, so if you haven't read it, just go with the discussion, or you can focus on Bloodchild, which is the first story. But essentially they're both stories about a world that's been taken over by aliens. And in Bloodchild, we see these giant insect-like creatures called I'm gonna ask you for the pronunciation
Oh.
if it's right. It's the TLIC. I just say it like.
Slick, yeah.
Okay.
Your guess is as good as mine.
Okay, great. And then in Amnesty, we see these giant plant-like communities. And in both of them, there's this sense of not only cooperation from the humans, but also resistance against these life forms. And, you know, I think in this, we've for centuries thought about this. I mean, there's movies, there's books, there's TV shows that grapple with what it's going to be like if there would ever be an alien invasion. And I don't think I've ever, save for one movie, seen something where it's not chaotic and just utter destruction. So what I wanted you guys to turn and talk about is what would you imagine an alien invasion today to look like? And if you think that we would be more like the characters in Amnesty, some of the characters who wanted to form resistance groups against the alien communities, or if we would be more like the people who were in Bloodchild, where we kind of just let ourselves stay divided, get conquered by the aliens. We'll do 10 minutes discussion, and then we'll come back and maybe discuss a few of the things that you guys talk about.
That speaker's turned off now, so feel free to talk there, and you'll be on the live stream.
It wasn't an invasion of Earth. They were Earth that had colonized somewhere else.
See, this is like unfair. I feel like I'm always looking at the side of the world for me, and I'm just like,
Yeah, for the most part, and I was trying to make the first question
Right.
interesting.
yeah.
So,
I actually, I'm glad that you asked it because it reminded me that there's like 10 things I forgot to mention, but it's fine. Okay, it's all good.
we can talk about it and discuss it. So, or you can talk about it right now. What do you think an alien invasion would look like?
I didn't prepare any of those questions. Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny to think about because
So in Bloodchild, they're like,
because the world that Octavia Butler was occupying was in some ways I don't know. Like I feel like even though she was dealing with things like racism and sexism, I feel like in terms of how we interacted with other countries, like we established certain rules that we're gonna follow and things like human rights that we're gonna try our hardest to endeavor to protect, and now I could be wrong.
Just like the pronunciation, your guess is as good as mine. I honestly don't know, but I think I'd agree. At least from what I hear, right?
There was protocols. That's what I'm trying to say. Like I feel like there was protocols that we used to think we all had to follow.
And actually, all of them.
Yeah.
Because we care more.
Or we thought that was important, and I don't know.
Yeah.
So we accepted it.
So I guess they're all right when they talk about alien invasion. We're just gonna like completely fall apart. That's kind of how I see it.
No, actually, I take back my entire answer because we were just listening to this podcast that was on testing the
Oh.
yeah, and I'm like, oh, you know what we would have done back then? It's the same thing we would do now, which is just
Because they haven't figured out all the things, so it's
That is true. Like, you know, the story in Amnesty, right? Towards the end, she mentioned that they did try to destroy the alien communities by using nuclear missiles, and they were just sent back. Yeah, which I think is honestly like a really badass thing to do.
I thought we were that way.
Yeah, they're terrifying.
basically take all the dead.
It's a bold move. They're just like, we have after them, so we can also destroy them when it's underground.
Technically, it's ours now, but we'll give you the
This is like it's not even like a peace offering, it's just like a warning.
yeah, it's in that
Yeah.
Like you left your toy.
I honestly don't know either.
Those aliens like that.
To be quite honest, I
How do you
think
communicate? So in Amnesty,
our governments
a
will
lot of
just
the teens
try to
were
destroy it
from the aliens.
as much as possible.
We're a colony.
And there might be collateral damage, and then it would be like,
How to communicate?
you either be successful, or they're not successful, in which case you've already
They
been
have no way to hear
hostile
language, so they don't. They
this
can't.
population that's managed to travel light years towards us, which means they clearly have better
Cause damage
technology.
along the way because you've just been setting off these nuclear bombs.
Yes, so I think it's probably going to be more like Bloodchild. If I were to logically it's a very important
Yeah, now that we've
question.
talked, I've just gone from here to down here. So
As is the case with most of my discussions recently. But it just makes sense. I liked how in Amnesty there was this I mean, Amnesty also talked about how this was how it went down. Both sides were hostile, but they eventually reached like a stage where they have their own, sections of the world, and they're not allowed to
They're
have
so
it
different
completely.
that we
And now they're offering employment. Right. And it's this weird dynamic that I can't really make proper sense of because there's too many nuances there. But I can totally see that happening because if they're here for good, they might as well do something.
And it seems, I think the past couple of years has taught us that Justin Bieber
I don't know about that, but
I guess that's what I
yeah, you'll have some people who want to be the mediators and help, and then others who are just like, you don't want this, but you can't do it. So
What are we gonna do with this?
how is
If you're
he
a
going
if you're a colony of plants, critter, you can't
to like reach a consensus about this so.
There was more like a community of having.
I pictured like those living walls. Like I pictured like a moving version of
I mean, so essentially the other part of this whole sci-fi thing,
They call them community.
how it's not just
in
about
the community.
culture and things about alternative realities, but it's also
All
something that is
it's like a whole termite mound
very
made up of
review that where the term Afrofuturism is.
they arrive.
So they arrive because they have to. I think they said that. So basically,
For him,
they were the
that was the other
but
thing.
the trick is their refugees are better at
Do you want to,
one of the instances.
well,
I'm sure it'll come up.
we're going to bring back
Okay, so we should fight. Let me tell you the story of the government like physically did in Paris.
Yeah, I'll jump in
Basically,
specific,
when
sure.
these things first arrived, like every single nuclear power station, and nothing happened. Just nothing happened, and instead like half of them get seriously re-delivered. Like not set off, just delivered to the places in South. So she said, so there was a resistance, but it was a quick one.
Yeah.
one of the
So why would we deal with it today? That was
Yeah, I
the
just figured.
question. So if an invasion happened now, how do you think?
I mean, I feel like I feel like we would be in that right? Like, our first thing is especially because it's a group of critters that we're like, we tried to be nice and they're abducting us. They obviously are mean. That's the other point. They don't get humans. They're not trying to torture. They just don't realize that
Trying to learn about it, so that involves.
involves experiment.
Okay, so back to Bloodchild.
They were trying to make sure that
On that example, they don't understand what
they didn't rush them.
they're slightly open and dig out the worms, how this particular
Well, that's the other thing is I don't think last minute
having the emotion for it, just like,
do the things that I normally do, but without them making it worse.
fighting the worms. It's like how we dig
So
around
I
in,
saw that you took a class on
so yeah.
Well, so this semester, I incorporated into the Women Writers class because it's normally
You go there and
in the summer, and I'm like, I don't know if I can make it out of my summers anymore, but I still want to do this. Things.
I love prom. It was very like lyrical.
There's so many
like things that were horrific to us.
Yeah, in the month of class, like they spend their time researching things. It's like
Do you think if an invasion happened now, it
work it into your
I'm sure.
would we fail to rise to the challenge because we're so
I
practiced?
feel like it would be again an answer like those folks who are like, yay, aliens, and we're gonna speak to them and we're gonna live with them. And then people are like, oh no, I saw Independence Day. I know how it says. Like,
I knew Independence Day was
I know. Right?
Rufus, do you want to bring us back?
Yeah.
There'd be the one side who's like, oh, we need to.
Okay. Do we have anyone who wants to share what they talked about? Do you think? Okay. Yes.
Yeah, we mostly ended up talking about amnesty since Bloodchild is really more about humans coming to an alien planet.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're like there's refugees coming to an alien planet, which is another thing, we were kind of concluding, there would probably be split reactions among the human race about alien invasion, and it would also depend what the aliens do. Like if they were in amnesty where they were just colonizing some barren deserts that we couldn't use, probably some of us would still be outraged just because it's our land and just like the possessive outrage of that. But it would also be there'd be a range of like, people who are trying to adapt, people refusing to believe it, people who are maybe seeing the aliens as some kind of religious coming, which is also, I think, Sorrel in the story was kind of like that. Like, it would be all over the place.
All right, that's a great point. All over the place is what I got, which is essentially what Dr. Millen and I discussed, right? Is you're going to get the whole range of chaos, and then eventually people coming to terms, and then a whole range of interpretations based on how much you want to reveal and how much you know about the aliens. So, Dr. Millen, do you have anything to add to that?
What I really liked about your response is that, I mean, we were talking about this just in terms of even just the pandemic and how people respond very strongly to things that they don't understand, and those strong responses can take different camps, right? And so, I jumped straight to atom bomb at some point in our discussion, but really what I think is interesting about this is just the way in which those camps can become entrenched, right? So somebody who's maybe a bit religious but interprets religion into this arrival all of a sudden like leans into that, and that becomes their way to understand the world, right? Yeah.
Do we have anyone else who wants to share? Okay. Yes.
So this is a little bit part of the question, but I wonder if you could comment on this. But when I read the story, I thought a lot about her novel Fledgling, and I wondered if maybe there was something to say about that. I mean, it goes beyond the question, but that was everything I thought about the story. I thought of the themes of Fledgling, and it seemed like they seemed to flesh out some of these.
Yeah, do you wanna talk a little bit about Octavia Butler's vampire story? Like, what are your connections that you're making to Amnesty?
So I think one of the things that struck me about the story, so it's the vampire story, and you have like what I think is a regular vampire trope. You have the class conflict. Vampires are powerful, long-lived, and think they're better than everyone. And but you have this group of vampires that have these relationships with humans that aren't exploitative. Or this is the question: are they exploitative? And so what I really liked about the story was it raised the question of what exploitation is, and is there really this kind of symbiosis or this mutual support that really benefits both parties, and so the line gets really blurry. And the other thing that I saw in this story that I saw in Fledgling was rethinking what pleasures are allowed, and what's legitimate pleasure, and like all those things are really brought up in provocative ways in Fledgling, because there's the appearance of intergenerational sex, and there's the interspecies, things like that, and so they seem to be nascent in this story. So I wondered, how you saw those connections, or what you thought about that.
Yeah, and I think with a lot of Butler's books, not just Fledgling, which if you're into vampires, read Fledgling. It's also one of her few that is a standalone book, so it's not part of a series. Like if you're not ready to commit to a series. But yeah, I think with Fledgling, with Amnesty especially, these are stories that reveal more about ourselves than about the story itself. And so yeah, if you see the relationships in Fledgling as being exploitative, right, I think that says more about you as a reader than it does about the story. And similarly in Amnesty, if you see Noah's reaching out as being a betrayal, then that might say more about how you feel about outsiders, or how you feel about different forms of nonverbal communication, or how you feel about sexual desire or comfort that has nothing to do with what you think those things are, right? And yeah, so I think in that way we can talk about how a story like Amnesty is as much about us as it is about the story itself, and we can see Butler doing that with the story, where she's just kind of examining all these different, as we were talking about, all these different types of human responses to this presence, and how they perceive Noah's role in that too. I think says a lot about how much we're willing to reach across or reach out when we don't understand that form of communication, or we don't understand that form of comfort. As far as Butler herself, if we want to speculate in that way, I don't know that there's specific evidence to support her sexuality in any particular way. There was questions about whether she was queer or whether she was asexual, but the idea of comfort and intimacy being this sort of weird kind of connection that's hard to pin down in the story, I think is kind of revealing of what she considers to be intimacy, or what she considers to be interactions, like good interactions between, I want to say people, between beings or creatures, right?
That was a great discussion. I actually want to keep talking about aliens and human reactions to them. So this is going to be, it's a segue, but we're going to talk about aliens from a different lens. So in Amnesty, James Audio and Theo Collier, I'm sorry if I'm messing up those names, but those were two of the interviewees included who were questioning throughout the book. And they were the two that had the most anger or negative reactions towards the communities. And so they used phrases such as, on page 122, these weeds can invade us, wreck our economy, send the whole world into a depression just by showing up. And then on page 137, one of them says they invaded us, they took us over, and on the same page it says it's ours, not theirs, referring to the world. And so, at least when I was reading those phrases, and especially when these characters showed up in that story, they're very indicative of like invasion and colonization. So their reactions were very similar to what I've seen in people reacting to certain types of invasion or colonization events in our history. And because this story was situated in North America, I believe, so I immediately went to Native American land and Native American people. And so one of the things I wanted to ask Dr. Milne is can you talk about one of the themes, the way I see it, which was mediating between humans and aliens by essentially joining, the quote-unquote enemy, which are the aliens, from a post-colonial lens. And so specifically, I wanted to ask, do you think that we could apply amnesty to real life, and have we already, to an extent, if you pull out, the colonization theme?
Yeah, actually, this will allow me to say the thing that I forgot to say earlier, which is that when we're thinking about what science fiction and fantasy can do, and they're often lumped together like that, so SF/F, science fiction fantasy, a lot of what it does is not just allow us to think about the past, and not just allow us to think about the future and where we're headed, but also allow us to think about the past. So in the Positive Obsessions essay, which is what I'm calling it, I know that there's another title for it, but that was the title she preferred, right? In the Positive Obsessions essay, where Butler's talking about her writing, she actually says, when I first started doing this, there was only one Black science fiction fantasy author out there, and it was Samuel Delaney. And what I find interesting about that mention of Samuel Delaney is that he was an author whose focus in science fiction was not just on the future, but on how we can grapple with the past. And so he, in an essay that where we get the term Afrofuturism, it's this essay interview with Samuel Delaney, where the interviewer Mark Derry says, "Hey, so what's the good about he's basically answering the question that Butler asked, which is what's the point of writing science fiction and fantasy if you're a Black author?" And he says, well, part of it is grappling with the past. Black people in general haven't had the luxury of contending with this past, and have in some cases been forbidden from dealing with this past. And so has this already happened? Yeah. Yeah, we can talk about how there's different models for thinking about first contact, for example, and how badly we've botched it when we're kind of looking at that moment where two different cultures meet, and instead of assuming good, right? Instead of assuming, they just don't communicate in this particular way, let's try something else. They just assume that they're trying to hurt them, right? And so you see Noah saying, well, yeah, they did hurt us at first, or we did hurt each other at first because we didn't understand. We didn't understand what it meant to deal with each other, what it meant to interact. And then once we figured that out, we were able to come to an understanding. And again, this is a moment that reveals more about ourselves than about the characters, because then you see, you kind of have to grapple with what does it mean to come to an understanding when you're still at risk, right? And so she says, it's not perfect yet, like we're still trying to figure some things out, But we're getting there. And it's getting to the point where we're actually benefiting from them being here. And as we were discussing with the whole atom bomb thing, they're not going anywhere, right? Like they have half our nuclear weapons at this point. We tried that route, the America First route, where we just tried to blow everything up, and that didn't work. So now we have to deal with it. And then the question becomes, how do we do that? So I think that this is just it's obviously science fiction, but it's also just a really good philosophical experiment into thinking about how this has been done in the past and how we might consider this in the future.
You also talked about communication between things, people, human beings, and aliens. And that's actually what I wanted to segue into next, because in my opinion, communication was one of the overarching themes, motifs, whatever you want to call it, in the book. There were several stories where I thought that it really was an important aspect of the story. So from my notes, in my opinion, the communication mishaps that you saw in Year of Kin was actually one of the reasons why you have this child who grows up thinking that their mother doesn't love them, but it's primarily because there was no communication, there was no open verbal communication about who her family is. And then in Speech Sounds, we literally saw a post-pandemic world where any sort of adequate verbal communication is destroyed, and the world goes into total chaos. And that's actually something I've never thought about, but it does make sense from the way she wrote the story. And then in Amnesty, what I noticed is the entire story is moved forward just from this one interview process, right? It's long stretches of prose that Noah is going into about her experience, and then it's interjected with questions from the interviewees that leads the story forward. So what I wanted you guys to talk about, and this is very open-ended, so feel free to go wherever you want, or maybe even discuss whether or not you think communication is an overarching theme in this, not in the short stories. But what power do you guys think verbal and nonverbal communication holds today, for both you personally, but also globally, when we think about how the world is today? So that's a turn and talk question for 10 minutes, and we'll come back and discuss it more.
Communicate to each other. Why communication is important or not?
Well, so one of the things I noticed, with is that a lot of people like to talk, but not a lot of people like to listen.
You're good. Sorry.
I was trying to narrow it down
It's hard,
so that
right?
it's
It's hard
more
to
targeted, but honestly, questions a lot.
Pause and like, no, it's this person's turn. It's like now.
Honestly,
and
I
it's
think
also very hard
communicate
when
better.
I'm passionate about to be like, to go into
Well, and lately when everybody's so tired all the time, like my go-to
it's very hard to
questions
listen to
is
the wrong.
yeah, or what you guys just talked about.
I mean, a lot of talking,
like,
not a
let's
lot
leave it
of
open-ended.
listening,
We'll
and
just
not a
go
lot
wherever we
of
go.
that back and
like
forth
that,
supposed to communication to kind of get where the other person's coming from. So we don't need to agree, but if we have a good conversation, I can at least like, okay, we don't need to agree, but I at least get where you're coming from.
And how much value you might have.
Where,
But
like,
I
that was
guess
so
it
out
doesn't
there
matter
and
all the time, but when I think about like major life events or major governmental organizations or people with power, I think that
Social media
communication is not really something, I don't think we're necessarily
shouting into the
or
void, eliminate narrative.
we're taught all these factual ideas and facts, but we're not necessarily taught how to create legal norm reference. And even if you're, it's like, I took one course that was do some PowerPoints and talk about a topic, and I was like, I'm pretty good at this. I'm finding it out. I'm good at this. But when you actually have to apply it in real life, that goes beyond just like you talking at a thing, but actually having a discussion back and forth is way different from what I've ever been taught in like a communication course.
Well, and I mean, and even there it's trial by fire, right? Like you just kind of get credit, and I feel like
they're
I have this
stupid
assignment.
because they can't
Sorry, I keep
understand
on thinking about
they don't speak
but I have this
language.
assignment where I
Drop
make
one. Philippines.
because
If you just speak lower and louder,
go talk to your mom
But even,
or something about this book, whatever book it is.
even if you get across, like, okay, I can understand the words of I lived in England for 4.5 years. Sometimes even there, they're like, what are you talking about? And it's just something, I called it a different word, or they don't have that here. Or just the amount of times, oh, don't say that. That means something very wrong.
Yeah.
So
And I mean, I'm kind of the same way. Like I would rather, like I would rather do
that
this for a
person,
crowd. Like
that culture because they don't have this, and they call it this. It's like no, this is this.
I'd rather like know nobody. And like in the whole valley. I don't know what that is.
Meetings of the like to all of them.
Something just came to mind and immediately exited. I think I was thinking about the way we talk to different types of people. Yes, right. And I've been like, why? I have, this is what I was going to talk about. Yeah, I mean, I've had,
I didn't realize that they were like
have a lot of things to say, and we'll say it, together, groups of friends, or
okay, you can fix the world. Go. Dang it.
I would agree with you, and
That would pick someone else,
it
please.
suddenly becomes like I don't know if I want to. They're not gonna, change their minds, and I think that's kind of where everything gets stuck is you're not trying to change people's minds. That's often the goal. If I'm communicating with someone, I'll communicate them on something with the goal of, hey, I want you to just exactly what I'm thinking right now. And they do the same, but it's not often that you can have a free flowing conversation.
For learning the language, and people did do that.
But at least you're more
But how do you go about learning the language?
That's not usually. That's not often the goal, at least from what
There
I've
was this. I think it was
Interesting that they were able
where they were
to
just
find
like
some kind of sign language communication.
they were talking about the rarity of language. How did people like we always get entrenched here? And then
I thought something like this with like a terrarium on top or something.
Correct. And how those you're gonna hate this. I'm sorry, but those
I know that.
I'm sure you do. But yeah, they were just like those are
There was a book
Well,
about
something that I remember from classes where I'd have to do presentations as you touch on the emotional aspects. Like that's
So
how
I
you
was
get
all
reeled
about
in.
the
That's I'm trying to keep them
because they
interested.
seem like
And
fungus
I
to
think
me
that's what
or
we're
the
doing.
type of interaction
Yeah, I kind of visualize something that's
Probably
slightly bigger.
well, and I think the podcast is saying like it makes
If
people
you've ever seen Spirited Away, the
once you start breaking
it's
I mean, I think that's not. I mean, that's not true for me. I don't think that's true for like everyone, but I think in general. Well, here's a citation.
Very which I think is more relevant today than
Enveloped or whatever, like
my history. It's like you really have to find ways to talk to
I don't know, I imagine like a thick brush.
large groups of people who have a full range of what you want to do. Yeah, which kind of goes back to what said about what are you gonna believe for alien invasion? Like you can make up a range of reasons why they're here based on your own experiences, but
how do you describe it?
I don't think it's going to matter if you talk
Okay,
about
okay,
that
they
they're
can see
here
so how
with
does
us.
this,
Right.
okay, but how do they understand that this is
It's very
scale?
subjective.
Like all, so even with people,
Communication overall
getting
is
rid
very
of, we're so used to being able to hear, being able to see.
Honestly, don't
And
think
even, I know, for instance,
I think it's learned.
like in Disney World, we're told to do
There's
this,
ways
but
to
pointing
change it,
is
but it's just
expensive, so.
in most of her
So
stories.
can you
that's
imagine,
what I
like,
found
you go there and you're like, hi, and
like
like,
they
they just
kept
basically
people
like,
really
yeah,
trying.
right.
And
Just say, hi.
some of the
What's the
So it's,
and that's
it's
actually how the
diversity,
story
accessibility,
that was like the whole
Yeah, and maybe they kind of
but it's basically,
how much more of
again,
us are just
not thinking that
resembling
everybody who's going to go through our speaks English,
yeah, I'm not going
can
to
see,
I don't know what
can
you're saying.
hear.
I'm going to listen to everything that you say and roll my eyes, like those particular things.
Yeah.
Oh no, that's what we all are now.
Yeah, we have so many biases. That's
what
why,
you're
like I
saying
was
is
joking earlier,
we all
about
just
I
need to
talk
learn
louder
how to
because
communicate.
I can't understand myself.
Yeah,
No, that doesn't mean.
yeah, right. So
Okay, well, mushroom.
I was just like, every time she starts talking,
It kind of blows like we were watching whatever that documentary and they talk about how like trees and I was like that the World Wide Web. I just like I'm still processing that, but it made me think of this story.
Well, the other characters didn't change, but those two were the most people like where like there were also parts where they
Like now we know how smart an octopus is, and you're like, it's related to a clam.
she like had an apple that she threw.
I don't know, I just remember you thinking
Yeah, and it's just like so.
I mean, that's a big thing. Like, you know, you see
It's so descriptive and the way that they react. Like,
how do you ask a fish this about things?
that we're willing to like work with?
Don't know. We can guess
That's
based
what
on
kind
the
of
neurons that
yeah.
are fired in the fact that it
Either
twitched and it felt pain. We have no idea about saying, does
I
it?
worry that none of us are fencing.
It's like when we imagine alien life forms, like in all the sci-fi movies
Just like,
and they all seem to be
I'm just spiraling here, I'm sorry.
something weird on their nose or forehead, but they're basically like us. In all likelihood.
So I'm just looking to you for cues.
Yeah, it is
So-
funny to think about.
Yeah, so they
why
invaded
we
us, they
made
took
it
over.
like this.
Yes, they invaded us,
From our
right?
times, and
So
then
like they're the ones
we're
who
like, oh, they clearly, we are the most evolved species.
yes.
So if they're more evolved than us, they must
Yeah,
look
you
like
can't
us.
change
but
that. That's like very
Facts yet, like, okay, so how can we relate to them? So, like, you know, if they look humanoid, then we're like, oh, if they're doing this evil thing, they know it's evil, they must be the bad guys. If they're doing this good thing, they know it's good, they must be the good guys. We're giving these plants an MNC, they're like, oh, well, that killed it. Oops. I didn't know that was happening.
It wasn't like a classic invasion, like they come in, boom, 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 shooting. They just came in settled, basically, where we already were. And,
They were basically the Bloodchild. So
yeah.
Talks about the children who have only known this reality, right? So maybe it's kind of like
And
this next generation.
I found it kind of interesting when she was teaching
A bit less
Octavia Butler made these aliens that do not look like us. So that's,
I wrote that down specifically because
of that how
I thought it was interesting that
storytelling
you don't have verbal communication for the most part. So
how would you react to something
these hand signals
not like
and created their own
everybody
language
knows you tend to be a bit more
where
comfortable
and own
more
like
open
phrases with the
someone who is familiar. So if you have this big bush coming at
you see that as like
are you going to be like,
or
there's a bush coming at me,
of
freak out?
value
Okay, it's bush coming at me, what's going to happen? What is it going to do?
I mean, like in the for Amnesty, like that's all they have, right? Is nonverbal.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. She purposely picked
I don't know. I feel like that's another
aliens.
skill that
And they're like, there's things that really freak us out, right? A giant centipede with a
forgotten to
stick
pay attention.
that engulfs
I
you
mean,
in
like, you know,
arms
even
and
lays
lays
eggs.
eggs inside of it. And then a fungus moving bush that engulfs you and doesn't realize when that it's like that Looney Tunes character who like hugs the character too tightly and doesn't realize.
and I don't know if
that
it
it's no longer
would add value, but I
it doesn't realize that, oops, I broke it.
and I just don't
yeah, I'd probably be like the sixth energy in that story. I'd be a tough sell for me to buy or to sign on for that, you know.
I appreciate you saying it wasn't like
Oh wow.
whatever it was, like that she went back. Like I thought that was really interesting.
I also like that was one of those turning points in the story where she's like, okay, so you guys have heard all the tales about what they did to us. Let me tell you what your own government did to you. And the difference is they know when they're
monthly for like
Oh yeah.
big thing.
Yeah, that was interesting.
This one's there's always a fiction, right? There's always like a fiction element, and then the rest are more science.
yeah.
That was like that was a big turning point in the story.
What I just figured out.
It was never
I
but at least they were trying to do something.
I can visualize where I was when I was listening to because that was a moment where I was like, oh, yeah, like, I knew I was feeling pain. The bushes did.
So again, it's like, am I saying that racism is so? But at least they were trying.
Here who've read the Xenogenesis.
And I can say that because I wasn't one of the people who died.
She
I
does
guess.
crazy. I mean, you think the whole bringing up male pregnancy thing is like she does a crazy thing to gender that
I like that she didn't sugarcoat. Like, no, it was totally fine. It was totally cool. So I came back because everything was racist.
yeah. Undergrad in fact.
And I do like that, like, one of the last things she
20th century
she kind of lets them, like, go on their rants. And she's like, so, let me tell you a story. I like you guys rant for a while. Don't forget they have the right? They basically, they just mysteriously send half of them back, like return to sender and disappear back into places. So I think not only did we take all of my but we purposely just handed some back.
Did I gloss over the explanation of that? Because apparently the Earth must have thought that they were really invading, room invading, rather
Because
than...
they were kidnapped for kids and stuff, but it's because they were trying to learn.
The bombs were a reaction. Hey, these are aliens. Let's nuke them.
I get it out of it. Sort of giant moving bushes, like, holy crap. Versus if they looked more like us, we'd be like, probably still about to start. We would, but we'd be like,
Now they have updates, so you're busy, then you might not want to start a series, but I love series. Look for it's called Xenogenesis starting the next. Yeah, because eventually, yeah, I think she
If
does.
you haven't read the book they did last week, that Entangled, have you read it?
I read it.
It blew me away.
It's a hazard, just like so. Oh no, you're fine. I know for a fact there are people who haven't read it at all. They're just required. So yeah, it's not required. And I think thank you for being here.
there's like a company that's making like furniture out of it. I knew about the packaging.
Okay, we are back. So I know this was a very broad question. I said it that way because I was just interested to know just more about what you guys think about this, and especially the nonverbal communication in relation to, to the speech sound story. So any thoughts that anyone wants to share? Yeah? Yes?
We had some debate because we were talking about like how nonverbal communication is important, but also verbal communication has this interesting role that we don't always perceive. We were talking about how like online, for example, well, I guess we were saying like, with the whole pandemic, people were already kind of in their own echo chambers online, just talking to people who thought similar to them. Like that was already the case. And then when the pandemic hit, that made the pandemic worse, and the pandemic worsened it even more. Like people who were anti-science got even more anti-science, and everyone else kind of spread out even further. But they were talking about like, well, there's something about talking to someone in person, even if it's just over video, your brain still interprets it as in person, and you're getting both verbal and nonverbal cues in a way that's really helpful. I'm sorry, I'm not being super articulate.
No, that's...
I thought speech sounds was actually really interesting in the way that was like, well, everyone still has nonverbal communication in that book, but the fact that verbal communication is taken away still kind of puts down this isolating wall that you don't really take, you kind of take for granted until you realize this happens.
Yeah, well, one of the things that I picked up from what you were talking about is the Zoom problem.
Yeah.
And at least in my career, we have conferences we attend in person that people have now had the chance to attend online, and it's cheaper. It's, anytime you can attend. There's lots of perks, but there are still people who want to attend in person, and they would prefer it in person, and that's kind of like the concept of you get both verbal and nonverbal cues plus the socialization aspect, and that all matters, and you don't realize it until you're sitting in front of your screens and you only are looking at like blocks of people, many of whom don't want to turn their cameras on. So that's a very interesting take on it. And Dr. Mullen, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, we were talking, while you guys were talking, we were talking about how ill-trained we are in general for anything regarding nonverbal communication, right? Like maybe we get a communications class where we learn how to project and we learn how to speak in short sentences. Obviously, I'm not good at that either. But we don't get training in what to do with our hands when we're standing in front of a crowd, right? And some of you in the audience have actually been with me on Zoom, where I have to remind myself to like make huge gestures so that my screen isn't just me talking, right? So that like there's something interesting happening, because that is all the more meaningful when you're not seeing the entire person in front of you, and that can be difficult. Related to this idea of silos, of getting entrenched in our own kind of worlds, I often talk to students about filter bubbles. So Ellie Pariser has this whole concept about how the Google that you see is different from everybody else's Google, right? Because you're only clicking the things that you're interested in, and the algorithms have learned what those things are, and so they're only feeding back to you that echo chamber that we were just talking about. And the only solution to this, apparently, is to try really hard to click things that you normally wouldn't click. And who wants to do that, right? Like that becomes something that you're just like, well, that's not worth the trouble. I'm just gonna, keep my world the way that it is. And so it takes work now. It takes work to have these moments where you're talking to people who disagree with you or who don't quite think the same way that you do. And it's sometimes uncomfortable. So yeah, it's a challenge sometimes. And I think especially in the world that we currently live in, it does require some extra effort. Thank you. Any other thoughts?
We talked a little bit about how communication has to go both ways. So you can't just be talking; you also have to be willing to listen. So that fits with a little bit of the whole thing without speech. Like you can see when the two characters are willing to take the time and actually try to get to know what each other's trying to say. And same with an amnesty, like us just talking at them isn't going to do anything. We also have to be listening to what they're saying. And again, that's a little bit uncomfortable because especially if it's something that you super believe in and they super believe in, you just want to keep going, yeah, but this. But at least if you're doing both the listening as well as the talking, you might not agree with them at the end of the conversation, but you at least get the background of how they got there. So I think in all of those, it's really important, because like even in the king one where she's like, I am willing to listen. I am willing to hear the truth, even if it hurts. So that having that listening part of communication is just as important as actually trying to communicate to someone.
Great, thank you. That's actually something that we also talked about, was the two-way communication. And the fact that we often forget that your goal isn't to convince someone of something that you believe in when you're talking to them, but it has to be open-ended. And you also have to be willing to change your mind based on what they might say. So yeah. Any other thoughts? Yes.
One of the stories that I don't think we've talked about is the evening and the morning and the night, and the nonverbal communication there, where it's like the pheromones or this chemical thing. We were talking about that and what that can mean, and so we thought that, maybe going back to what the opening remarks about the importance of writing is that these stories are mirroring what's going on in ourselves that we don't recognize. And so there's this nonverbal communication that they don't even understand, they don't even know. And so when you're talking about being open, changing your mind, you have to be open to completely new ways of communication. And as we talked about this, we were thinking about the encounters of colonizing other people, and I think sort of relating that to the dynamics in the story where they're uncomfortable with each other and the one character doesn't know why. This might happen when two different cultures meet, and the ones with more power can be like, oh, this is uncomfortable, we're just going to subjugate you. And so it seemed like one of those things that Butler does is sort of complicate those encounters to where, like, well, here's somebody that has slightly more power in the evening, in the morning, in the night, but being like, okay, yeah, it's not going to work for us to be together, but here's maybe what we can do to help all these people. So I guess those were two sort of aspects of it, but yeah, just learning, we were communicating and didn't know it, right? All these people are calm, some people are cut off.
That is a fantastic analysis, because I did not think about that when I was writing this question or thinking about it at all. And it actually makes a lot of sense because the story continues for a little bit after they discovered the smell. And I had a lot of trouble understanding what the problem was, right? Like, to me, it's like, here's a solution. They should be able to use this. But the characters, all three characters towards the end, had this like mental block to an extent of why this is a good thing or a bad thing. And that is exactly what you said. It's very interesting that is something that is considered a nonverbal communication form.
I was thinking of when I read that story, I'm bad with titles, of the evening and the etc. When I was thinking of that story, I was remembering, I don't even know if this is actually accurate science, and I'm speaking to a group that contains a lot of scientists, so I'm kind of nervous about saying this, but when I was remembering this news story that talked about Alzheimer's patients and how when you're communicating with them, it's best to kind of work with their reality. So if they're existing in a space of time that's like, 20 years in the past, and they're talking about you like you're 20 years younger, you go with that, right? Rather than trying to correct them or trying to win and saying, no, it's 2021 now, and here's, the president is this, and we're in this place, right? Instead of doing that and stressing them out, the suggestion was, well, communicate with them on their terms. Right, like if they believe a certain thing, just go with that. If they want to talk about this topic, then go with that. And that can be very difficult when number one, you're right, because that's how we all feel, right? Like, oh, I know I'm right here, but this person needs me to be this way, and I'm gonna go with that because that's what's gonna be the most ethical and the most proper response to this. And so even thinking about communication on that level is something that I was considering with that particular story, which is what are the terms under which we can have a kind of positive interaction, and how does that work when somebody's resistant to that?
Yes.
I wanted to add one other thing about the story that I didn't mention that seems really important to me about Butler's works, and I think the thing that sticks with me about the play's art stories, and so that something comes back from space and it infects people, and then they transform and they have to infect other people, but so there's going to be a new species. So, but the thing about the story is you can't control it, and you know that you have this, and you're trying to protect people, but you know you're not going to be able to. And so there's this real struggle that you're determined by your actions are determined by this thing more powerful than you. How do you manage it? And so there's something really seems tragic, but again, in Butler's story, it's not quite tragic. Anyway, this seems something like that in the evening, in the morning, and the night, because you have this kind of thing you can't control. And so communication seems, we think of communication as like, well, I can get my message across, or we can solve problems. And here, my first thought was like, this is wrecking communication. It's the opposite of communication. But then that's when we were talking about, and my friend Phyllis said, well, these stories mirror us to ourselves so we can, then we can understand it. And so I guess I'm just expanding on what I said, I got from your opening remarks, how these stories help us, that they mirror these things and they give us a measure of understanding and then a kind of control. We can't control pheromones or when we fall in love or when we hate someone for some irrational reason, but we can understand it and do something about it. And so I think that goes directly to the question about the power of communication, power of understanding, and, well, being open to listening, being open to changing your mind. But that story, I think, is really dramatic.
Right.
Start.
Yeah, it's the communication, but then once again bringing in the human connection and understanding how you're connecting to each other, which goes beyond just talking at people, right? And yeah, I do have a question about that at some point, so you'll get to talk about that story more, hopefully. So I actually want to ask Dr. Millen a question that's going to switch into something that's more related to Butler as a writer, because there were two short stories, two essays that were included in the book that I thought were interesting because they were just personal essays from Butler, in which she talks about her writing and how she became a writer. And so in the short essay that was titled Positive Obsession, she talks about how she became a writer, her mother supporting her, paying more than a month's rent for an agent fee that was wrongfully asked for. And it talks a lot about her being, in a time and space where she was a poor black woman and writing was not really considered a career. And so she goes into talking about how her advice to people is to just fake everyone out, including yourself. So that was a quote from page 103. And what I wanted to ask you, considering your expertise with gender studies and literature, is do you think that Octavia Butler was alone in this sort of career journey that she had? as a writer, or do you think that she's joined by other Black women or men? And do you think her experiences are also similar to non-people of color? So essentially kind of comparing her with other writers.
Yeah, it's I feel like I'm such a downer today. It's kind of a sad story, really, because the reason why we have all the kind of explosion of science fiction fantasy that we have today, like people like Tochi Onyebuchi or people like Victor LaValle, is because of Octavia Butler, which is to say she was alone for most of this. I mentioned those boxes of notebooks that are at the Huntington Library, and it's literally boxes. There's this woman, Linnell George, who wrote this book called A Handful of, oh gosh, here I go with titles again. A Handful of Stars, I think, A Handful of Sky. Anyway, it's a book about Octavia Butler's formation as an author. And because there's all kinds of, if you have boxes of stuff, right, there's all kinds of ways that you can try to analyze it. And so she specifically says, well, I'm curious as to see how Butler sort of shapes herself as a writer. And the answer is she had to do it through hard work. Like, there was no other way. She didn't have Black Panther, the movie, to say, oh, well, they're doing science fiction fantasy with Black people and it's made billions of dollars and I can just, turn out my pages and somebody will give me money for it. That's not exactly true now, but you know what I mean? Like, there's no encouragement out there for her to say that this is something that she could do. And other than her mom, there was really nobody else in her life saying that she could do this. And so what you see on the backs of these notebooks and on these pages are notes to herself, sometimes lists, sometimes sentences where she says, you can do this. She's just trying to convince herself over and over and over again, you belong here, it doesn't matter what anybody else says, you're going to be a bestseller one day, and then she'll have story ideas and then she'll have grocery lists, right? So she has all these things sort of mixed up, like all her life mixed up together, and constantly throughout, all you do is you see her trying to fake herself out, trying to convince herself that she can do this, because nobody else was telling her that. And so this is why I think representation is so important in literature and popular culture and so on, is because the harder she had to work to do that, the less time she had to write, and the less time she had to create anything. And unfortunately for Octavia Butler, she didn't have that long on this earth, so she died, I think, in her 40s. And imagine what she could have done if she didn't have to stop every few minutes to just try to convince herself that she belonged here, that she belonged in her industry, that she belonged as a writer, that she belonged as a woman, and as a Black woman, right? And all those things that she had to do was extra work that she had to do on top of the work that she had to do to get her books published. And so just kind of imagine, right, the world that we live in now, I think we kind of take for granted that it had to start with someone, and Octavia Butler is who we have to look back to.
Thank you. I was gonna just mention that I really liked the archery analysis or metaphor that she gave about. I'm gonna not mention this properly, but it was it's based on the title Positive Obsession. And I'm gonna need you to help me because I'm blanking right now. But it was a section in Positive Obsession where she describes that she had taken archery because it was an individual sport, and basically learned that you have to focus and persist and do it over and over again, right? Am I? Mm-hmm. And I really liked that because it's kind of relevant to. I still think of that in like today's world, in pretty much any career, where if you're disadvantaged in any way, you kind of just have to keep going at it, and there's no other way. And so I really liked both of her essays, because that was kind of what she drove home, is that the role might suck, but you're just gonna have to keep doing what you want to do if you really love it, and at some point you will be talked about, in a book club, in a brewery someday. So yeah, awesome.
It's the ultimate goal for everybody.
Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna switch into a turn and talk that actually goes into the Book of Martha, which was the last short story. Again, if you did not get a chance to read that, I will try my best to keep the question a little vague, but essentially the Book of Martha is a conversation between God and a woman as she appears to be in heaven. And they have a back and forth, and God wants her to basically make a decision about some sort of event that would help humanity. And the story just goes back and forth in her trying to decide what that means and what she wants it to be and what God wants from her. But what I wanted to focus on is on page 143. God says, "You see what your life has prepared you to see," and that's in response to Martha when she asks why God appeared to her as a bearded white man. And then as the story progresses, we actually see that she sees God as a black man and then eventually a woman. And I just thought that was really interesting. The phrase itself, I immediately was like, this makes total sense, like in general life too. And that's kind of what I wanted you guys to discuss is, what would that phrase mean to you today? You see what your life has prepared you to see. And why do you think Butler wrote the characters of, or I guess the portrayals of God the way that she wrote them, the progression of a white man into a black man into a woman as it appears to the main character. So that's 10 minutes and then we'll come back.
Answering your questions with things that I wrote later. So I was like, oh no, now what am I going to say?
The last one for the bar or whatever you guys have to do.
Women in STEM, right? It's like kids.
I said the last call for everybody.
Yeah, just last one.
That's what they saw, right? That's what they kind of knew.
Literally till whenever you guys are.
What we're talking about is,
You either need another drink right now,
if people, if that's all they grew up with, then they're going to be like,
Yeah, I might get a Moscow Mule.
we're like, oh, girls don't
Do you want to go get it?
Literally
just here helping like facilitate things.
Thank you.
oh, that's not a thing, then you don't get it.
I was like, oh no, I need to.
Genuinely don't know.
Yes, absolutely.
Like, you truly, like, it's not like, it's not like you don't
Yeah, this question I also kept brought, but I highlighted the story. I highlighted their page numbers are different from mine. Yes, they were talking about. Sorry. I mean, that's always.
Mirror and a window is just like, for kids, they need both mirrors
No, I
and
love
windows.
this
The
story.
mirror
I was
is
actually-
to be able to see themselves in the different things.
I was kind of fascinated.
It doesn't matter.
And I know she didn't put together this collection, but the fact that it ends with this one.
Literature or whatever.
Why?
They
I mean,
need to
because
be
it
able to see
starts
themselves, but they
out
also need to be able to see other points of
Yeah.
view.
I mean,
So like,
like the setup story.
So for instance, we did a
Bloodchild's the first story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seeing where other people
Yeah,
are coming
starts out so
from.
dark. So you think it's
Stats,
I
they're
wonder.
also
Yeah, I wonder if that's what the press actually intended.
taking public transportation, like yes, because I live in Philadelphia.
Guess
and
what?
like,
Somebody's
everyone
getting
takes
me a drink. Isn't that amazing?
Oh, really?
Oh,
I could
that
get
must
used
mean
to
you're
it.
not you weren't well off, right? Because you didn't have a car. So that's a public transportation.
I'll just call every single time. I'll be qualified for any of them after this, but I'll just be like, yeah,
seeing these different
$50. Yeah, what do you want to do? Absolutely.
What's wrong about taking public transportation? Why do you see that as like a
No, yeah, I think this is a story that it didn't make as much of an impact while I was reading it, and then I finished it, and I was like,
see anything outside
actually,
when you were walking.
there's a lot more to it.
Oh,
Because the story itself is
of
very,
course you get your driver's license, as soon as you
I say straightforward.
and then I will play the lead. I still don't have my driver's license.
And I'm like, I'm already
Drive
back. So you're getting me a drink? Thank you. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how I would answer the question that slowly. That's actually like I've seen myself with Martha.
Exactly.
And like, then she finally, she saw her own representation
Of like the
and
fact that she sees
what she was capable of.
It's like, when she first met him.
But yeah, the fact that
I'm
she
not
sees
worthy,
what.
right?
I mean, yeah, I think that would be
It's like, oh yeah, I can't be here. Like, why would God ask me versus a person down the street? So yeah,
Intimacy, like, then they're
Well,
even
I realized this after I read the
like together rather than like
I did more like one.
so again, it went from what she thought, like, oh,
Yeah, I
God
bet they're
is
important,
this
but I
white
did more
bearded
to
guy,
it, so I'm not sure if they happen
really
to add like
powerful
the
folks,
story
and
and
he
it
does
just pick up because it was such
mystic
a
land. It went from that to
Does it go from so
God,
is he
black
a
chicken, white
white
kitchen,
male and then
cool,
black
so
male, or is he a
again,
black
it went from like
woman? He's a black
she
man
thought, like,
and
oh, this
white.
is all
Okay, who is? I was trying to
God.
remember the order. Like not as tall, but
This
just
is my
like just
encounter with God. It could be whatever. And she's like, you know what? I like
as,
this
like,
happening. Meal around the kitchen. That's better than being in the sea of gray.
kind of towering over her still.
the women they don't really talk about. So these are they're very like just touching on like, oh, he's an hourglass man.
Right, and then they continue their conversation.
Yeah, and they continue their conversation. So anyway, you would miss it, but I just thought it was interesting because the whole phrase that stood out to me is your life has prepared you to see what you. That's what you see, right? And to me, that's just sort of
We're gonna say that,
the entire world, right? Like you have your lived experiences, and that is how you see the world. And that also falls into like communication patterns. Like if you are not taught how to communicate, or if you're taught to communicate by screaming at people or not agreeing with them, that's kind of what you see when you talk to people. That's what you see.
I find that exact point because I feel like I might disagree with it. You know what I mean? Like I feel like I would my first go-to if I were to envision a godlike figure would be just because that's what's been Barbie's little
Yeah. I often say he.
and then yeah, she automatically switches pronouns and changes to woman, right?
Yeah. It is. So it's like the third page, or it's the second page. So it's really
There's a whole community.
I mean, just to show, like, I mean, I still have a distinct, like I kind of know, or very much like, trying to find any character that has curly hair. Like growing up, I couldn't, like, the American Girl dolls came out, like, get one that looks like you. None of them had curly hair.
I guess that's true. I guess
There's no, Violet America came out with Disney princesses, but nobody had curly hair. I'm like, curly hair! You can't tell me.
I mean, I don't know. I took it almost, like when you were reading it, I was just like, is it like
the one that was I mean, that's one interpretation.
Yeah.
But to me, it's just like you are, there's a philosophical ideology that says you were born with like a tablet awesome. Then you are given all these ideas and thoughts, and that paints your entire world, and to an extent, like blinds you to certain things. And that's sort of what I saw here. It's not that it blinds you to certain things, but it's just like the world, like you said, you were taught
how you're kind of trained. So if you're a kid and you're
but
growing up,
then the more she
every single doll you have,
why she's here,
blonde hair,
why
blue
she
eyes,
has to do
straight,
this,
perfect, and then you get to that awkward middle school phase,
and then suddenly it's like God is perfect. And that's the final form, and I just, I don't, I was interested in what
the nerd is still the nerd, and they're the not cool kid. When
progressing in that. Because
I wonder if that's going to be one of the last discriminations to go is
like
against the
still,
nerds or
like
against
why are kids going into
basically
STEM?
a
Like,
story about
you
her.
still have every single character who's smart.
All of it is just like
nerd, and
one
kids
question
that
of
you
what
show
should I do
that it's
that helps you kind of
all they want is
So if you keep
going, oh, that's not going to
hammering
work.
at it,
Yeah, it's not going to work.
So I wonder if that's a way to tell her like, oh, now you're seeing what you really see.
So it's basically so the
And what you prepared to see, which is now like now woman. And now you come to the conclusion that this is the
prepared
life
to see.
happens.
So basically how you
And then she chooses to forget the
That's
entire
not-
conversation.
Yeah.
why do I see what
Yeah. Like, I almost wonder if this has happened before. Where I'm confused. It's like, okay, hey Martha again.
going to church every single time.
Hello again, Martha. What are you gonna try this time?
What if it's like story after story of her just having like different things she thinks of.
He's like, someone tried this. I'm not gonna say it was you, but someone tried this and it was wrong.
Humanity sucks because of me now. That's
You, Mason.
This is all her fault. Everything in the world today. This is for one woman. It's actually really
all
funny and interesting. I did
God,
not think about that.
When you meet you, it's a dismissive
Because
place.
I'm just thinking of the good place now because of how she was just
I've seen
like I don't want to spoil it.
and
Yeah, so they have to choose at some point whether to
I might be spoiling like the entire life stream.
So the ending is the good place. But yeah, no, there's different points where they're asked like these kind of philosophical questions. What they choose to bring back to how do you do it?
There's I really read an autobiography of Malcolm X.
Someone asked me that.
Passage there where there's some educator in Brooklyn, wherever he was at the time.
Yeah, I'm just like,
Talking about Jesus, so Malcolm was
And I also
educated, said that.
afterward
Why
version.
it
It says that this is for Utopia.
See in Aramaic, and finally
Because
the guy, he was brown or something,
hell, and I have never thought about it that way. But when you think about all the utopian novels I've read, there's so many unhappy
Why in all the
and like why would you have unhappy people in utopia? It goes against everything. So I don't think we'll have a utopian story. So
if someone's like
genuinely
that
there's an Ursula Le Guin story where
everything's the same except
basically
they have
the only way that the utopia functions is that one person has to take all of the parts.
Like why is Stormtrooper just wearing
Yeah.
plastic body armor or whatever? Like, what does that
She
make
forgets
any
it,
sense?
so she chooses to forget.
Why did they shoot
I don't know why I want to
at this
think of her
point
as coming
in
back.
the science, they should just have like, automatic, right? Like wherever they're aiming.
Oh no, not 15
That's
different
some
Nazis.
IR detecting thing.
Well, same with
50
like,
versions of Book of Mormon.
why, if they actually, I forget what it's part of
That would be like a great.
Why are all the best
Yeah, for someone.
possibilities?
Not either of us. I mean, you
What
did
is it
I
they're
don't
all like,
think I
yes,
have
he's
no
got a
idea.
British accent, he must possibly.
Dr. Moriarty.
You don't want to do it. Maybe this would be actually fun.
They're Russian.
Oh yeah. Okay. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. All right. So again, I kept this question pretty broad and vague because there are a lot of elements to the story that even Dr. Mullen and I talked about. But I want to hear from you guys first. So if there's anyone who wants to share about what they talked about. Anyone? Okay.
I don't want to be the first one.
No. That's fine. You're representing your group, so it's all
We
good.
started out with thinking like, yeah, how many of us when we read the first page of the story was also picturing God as a big beard white man? And most of us were, just because that's like the cultural stereotype we were brought up with, either by being Christian or just by cultural osmosis. And then there's another line that I couldn't quite find, but Martha was saying something like, yeah, she wished she thought she was already out of the mental cage that she was in, like the culture was imposing on her. But then over time she starts to break out of it, and that's why she starts to eventually envision God as a black man and then a black woman.
Do you wanna add anything to that? Go ahead.
Oh, well, yeah, we were talking, so I was actually asking Jill what she thought about the fact that when I was listening to her read the line, you see what your life has prepared you to see, it almost sounded accusatory, like, hey, this is the life you chose and this is how you chose to see me, but I guess another way to think about it is more in the way that you were just discussing, which is that, well, this is the life that we've led, and our lives have led us to view figures of authority in this particular way.
Yeah, sorry, I just had an epiphany.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is what her intent was. We were talking about representation earlier, and it almost made me feel like Octavia Butler had to keep convincing herself that she was good enough, and like kind of in the same way, like Martha convinces herself that she's good enough, and so she's able to comfortably see herself in God. Because in the end, God almost looks like her sister, almost like herself. So potentially it's an allegory there. Not sure if that's what was intended. But I just realized that.
Yeah, that's great.
I think that's great too, because I was wondering exactly why Butler would have picked, the progression, the way that she picked them, the different versions of God. And I don't think I came up with a clear answer, and I would have preferred her to just tell me why she did it. But I think your explanation makes total sense to me. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yes.
We actually talked a little bit about, so we got on the topic of representation, and we were talking about like Barbies and American Girl dolls and how much they've changed. But even with like the American Girl dolls, they've been made to look just like you. They couldn't pick one that had like bifocals or the neck curly hair, and so that even though you can customize things, they're still really limited. And so
Yeah, I think it's at least something that I think about when I read things or watch things is something that's very commonly heard now is why don't people look like me? Or, you know, your friends that's not as representative. And I was telling Dr. Malone that every time I talk about God, you know, I say he, because that's, again, it's like a cultural osmosis. That's what I've come to think of whenever I talk about God. But she, in the story, the Book of Martha, it was just very interesting that there are, the phrase that, the reason I chose to talk about that phrase too is, you know, you see what your life has prepared you to see, but then the story kind of walks through Martha thinking about things, and like, so you see her have like epiphanies of sorts, and that's kind of when the forms change. And I don't know about the relevance of that, but I think it matters when we talk about how much we think about things that we're consuming, right? And how we have like natural biases because of living in a culture that, you know, you have a lot of things being thrown at you. You have social media, you're reading things, you're watching things, and you just naturally pick up on a lot of different ideas that paint the way you view the world. And that's kind of what I liked with that phrase is, your life basically prepares you to see people the way you see, like right now. You know, when you're talking to someone, you have a unique way of perceiving them because of your personal lived experiences, and what they're talking about is also, it goes through that filter. And in the book, I think, or in the short story, the way I viewed it is that she was kind of shedding those, and, you know, leading her to the end where she found this pretty brilliant idea of how to get the perfect utopia for everyone. And yeah, those are my thoughts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I talk a lot about, in post-colonial theory especially, I talk a lot about this idea of unlearning, right? And so you learn certain things, you internalize certain things, and then if you want to move past those to view, say, your version of God as being different, you have to unlearn the version that's been fed to you, or the version that you kind of internalized as being the normal or ordinary version. And so that takes work too, right? Unlearning takes as much work, or sometimes more work than learning. And so when we're talking about these versions of representation, we're coming up against how many, I mean, I don't know how long it took the American Girls to the dolls, right, to suddenly be more representative, but right, like how many years that took versus how many more years it's going to take till they finally have bifocals or something, right? So that kind of process of unlearning takes time as well. We were talking earlier about amnesty and how there are people willing to listen and change their minds, and then there are a lot of people, like maybe all of us in this space, who don't change their minds very easily, and sometimes it's not in us to do that. Sometimes maybe it's the next generation, or sometimes it's happened slowly over time. So yeah, I kind of like that idea that you guys were bringing out, that maybe this is her becoming more confident and her beliefs about what might work for humanity or might not work, and then all of a sudden she's better able to see a version of herself in somebody else.
Okay, so I have one last turn and talk, which I really want to touch on because I think it's interesting, and hopefully we can inject some science into this. So in the short story, the evening and the morning and the night, we see people who are suffering from DGD, the diarrhea goat disease, and you know, there was a common theme of not feeling like yourself within your own skin, and this was very much a reflection of what the society in the short story cast on them, as much as it was like their own perception of themselves. And I wanted to kind of convert that into real life, where, you know, we have certain diseases that are more accepted, or survivors that are commended for surviving a disease, versus others that are more stigmatized or otherized, essentially. And I thought it was very interesting that in the story, in the end, the solution to, at least the solution that was offered, was within the very people that were suffering from the disease, right? No one knew how to do how to treat these people, but they found a solution that was based in the people suffering from DGD. And so what I wanted to talk about is, to what extent do you think that within our own society, that our stigmatization of certain diseases or certain illnesses has hindered our abilities to find treatments or find solutions for those diseases. And that's our turn to talk. So we'll do 5 to 10 minutes. We'll keep it short, and then we'll come back and close it off.
Like the stigma related to diseases, which like diseases are just deviations from the and it doesn't mean that it's like bad or good or not the average.
Yeah, okay, so
This is all you. You tell me.
well, so when I was writing this question, I was thinking about mental illness because I did my PhD in neuroscience, and I worked primarily
You just don't exercise.
PTSD, a little bit in like
Alcohol.
autism,
You're just a drunk.
depression, anxiety, stuff like that. And so that's kind of what I was thinking of, because that's the most clear example of the sort of stigmatizing, an illness that has physical.
But then there's still that stigma.
That people didn't read as well.
Right, and because we still don't know enough about it, there's still stigma. And so because of that, even like the few options we have, which is like therapy, and other forms of therapy that are not as accepted, like those are not, those are also stigmatized, right? And so you end up just getting kind of, I don't want to say pandemic because that's like a trigger word now, but you have so many people suffering, and there's no other way to approach it than to get more information from them.
Able to control that.
Right. I feel like they are, even if we're talking about like physically, there are ways to look at genetics and bodies and what's changing, and using that to figure out treatment options. But because it's so stigmatized, there are people who just don't want to go in. And even if you go in, you don't really know exactly how to treat things. You don't want to put in the work to do that. And that's kind of compared to things like cancer. Where we put in a lot of effort and money and effort to cure people, which is also very important. So I guess what I'm getting at is, in the story, this is something that's very serious. Like they're hurting other people as well as themselves.
Yeah, when they're
and it's
talking about
dangerous.
the author.
And there's still like a otherizing, isolating way of being a part of society. But then they're just like told to go live in like until they die.
Wasn't there, I mean, I don't know if I'm remembering this properly. Did we not even talk about until they got to know each other better? Like that she was discussion about parents and whether both parents have it or not.
So when you go to this
Because I wonder with something like some things that we're starting to understand,
like where do we,
especially with mental health, how you might not even know that your parents have a history of mental health.
We used to do things. We evolved cavemen or cave women.
we can engineer solutions to things that are different at that point. So, like if it's bad.
I don't know, like I think it's cultural too.
If you're born without the genes to be able to run fast enough to catch the deer or whatever, that doesn't matter so much today.
Not at all the way that Americans because I'm always kind of struggling myself. Like that's not the way that discussed it. I mean, it's equally problematic, but it's also
I'm Indian, and so I'm seeing it. It's also
it's a matter of fact, which is
So against
great, but then it becomes
why are we spending all this money?
it's a matter of fact way of saying
A family member.
something they'll
exactly. You don't need to pay any attention, and it will go away. Which makes it worse, but clearly not like serious cases. And not every person, but I think it works. I think it works for certain cultures.
I mean, that
you
kind of
don't have
shows
to address it as something that's real.
healthcare, right?
You kind of put it all on the person and their personal
I don't want to be
preferences and
given
choices
money.
and say
I don't know
like
that person.
you're choosing.
That's
Choosing to behave a certain way
okay.
because they've actually really been
I
studied
got
to
the
just like
NHS. It was great. If I was sick, I walked in and somebody treated me.
So
And you know what? I heard
with the guy who says like basically
them like 50 cents out of my paycheck goes to little
just how she that's just how she is.
But that's another
Towards the end.
Yeah.
What she chooses
put a
to
cost on
consider
this.
actually helping.
So I feel like that really
She's like, I have this thing, this ability to do
cost of the priest to do better.
Yeah, I don't know.
So say we have this drug that'll cure Alzheimer's.
Actually, I think it's now that you don't talk about it,
$10,000
himself seems very
per treatment.
stuck in his ways where he's been told that this is a disease and this is what's going to happen. So he's chosen to sterilize himself. And he's already made decisions for his life because he's like, I'm never gonna
Are you willing to
be able to do this or that.
So it's like a sense of control for him.
never met versus
Which I guess is a
So again, chances are we all had
one solution.
New condition, and
that
we're
also
given the
happens.
choice of 5 conditions to donate to. We would donate to the one that we do suffer.
I guess learning disabilities is
So now I'm reading the definition.
That's
of
very-
disease, and it's kind of interesting. A disorder of
it's not,
structure or function in the human
it's clearly
animal,
a
especially one
disability
that produces
that has physical
specific
basis
signs or symptoms
find ways
that,
to treat it,
or that affects a
but
specific location.
it's often the one that's like more stigmatized by parents.
Direct result of
And-
physical injury. What I find
I
interesting
think it's
of that is that we have bacteria.
I think it's very
We have bacteria that live in our gut
to this,
and they have a function. So what's the difference between having a productive?
it's kind of like you're saying this is how your life is
You're
going to
not
be.
not
Right.
humans
And then
as much as
you're just
there are
letting that
certain,
be. Like you're letting a self-fulfilled
that we've actually
prophecy.
decided
You're
we
saying
really
there's
like, so like tulips, right? Like
This is the rest of your life.
infected with the virus, right? And
Yeah,
part of
and
the reason we
I-
have
you
such
know,
a
from a-
broad
from-
range
from a
of
scientific
dogs, there was some
viewpoint,
mutation
as someone who's like,
in this, and
we
we're
have
like,
these
that's
things,
pretty
we
darn
can figure out
cool.
what's
I
going
like
on,
that.
and we can
Yeah, we've never shied away from.
which is like basically
Well, that's
this whole scientific funding.
I was saying we've never shied away from.
It's wild that
That's not true.
that
I
they
guess
have,
we have.
they know that there is something
I mean,
that's
that's kind of also why we
they know that there's a symptom
involved in it.
or a smell, sorry,
But
and that's
yeah,
physical,
I
and
think
you
it's
can
good.
probably figure out what that is and test on it, and I don't know, market it
How the
somehow.
definition you
Of
just
course.
read includes like
And
injury
yet,
or
this
something
is the
like that.
first time the characters find out about it. They only find out about it by chance. Right. Because the girl, the main character, ends up being
Or maybe he was in a car accident.
so had she not been, I'm wondering
But you may
who's
assume one or the other based on your history. I know that's what
you
people
know,
do.
the woman who led that center, the treatment center, didn't seem to want to necessarily, right? That's what I got from it. It's like if she hadn't been a double, or she's saying double protectoress, yeah. And so if you do that, how are you ever going to make this something available everywhere? That should not be the rule. It seems like she's. I mean,
Way
the
back
reason
when
why
it
she's
was
protective is
right.
because
Oh, so and so
The medical
must have been
health.
sleeping around.
right. Yeah. Then if you scientifically study this, you
Stuff like that.
find out more. And so it's a very odd way to look at it because it's like she's kind of like a gatekeeper of this very possible treatment option that can save a life.
Assisted living.
Which seems very important because they're very smart. They talk about how they're incredibly intelligent. If they were able to live longer, they would be able to like go to med school. I can't remember the other professions, but I know med school was like the most viable option for people because they were so good at it.
And it's hard, right?
It's
You
like
know,
imagine what you could do if they could just live a little.
we spent $10,000 on this disease. Thousands of people, some
Year-old med students,
but it's something that just
going to those fields and they don't necessarily. They like shut themselves off.
super rare disease that
It's as a treatment.
1 in 1,000 people get, but it's so crippling and can kill them by one and all that.
I'm reading this book called The Emperor Ball Now.
Oh, I've heard about that about
right like that being like, well,
It's
because
about cancer.
she looks like
Heard
that,
that
she must be
And they were talking about like cancer wasn't even
there's already the
to
stigma
the point of like people were dying of cancer.
like that. And I wonder if there's good.
So it wasn't even a thing.
I'm good at this, but I'm not going to use this. Like, I'm not here selfishly. Like, I'm here to.
Now, whatever, the past 50 years, they were like, and you're talking like, what if they
Yeah, I
kill
just I know. Unfortunately, I think you guys have got used to it. No, I mean, it's really change the world if you're not doing it. It's like, now we have the end of the story.
Well, what if the cure causes this DGG story?
Oh yeah. Like,
That was me too.
Came from a cure for cancer.
Yeah, you never know what the downstream implications.
All right, we are back.
universally caused.
So I asked this question because I am a neuroscientist by training, and I work in a lot of, well, most of the labs that I worked in are disease-based, so we research diseases, how they happen, and how we can treat them. And so I was just telling Dr. Milne that at the end of the story, I really did not understand the dilemma because they had a solution and they just had to do it. And I kept thinking, what is the problem? This is so clear to me. It's facts. So I was lost on why there would be discussion about this, and that's why I played into this question. So anyone have thoughts?
Me?
Yeah.
So we're talking about how some diseases already are kind of viewed as ones that people should be able to control and are kind of like, you know, it's on them, they could have done this, so like obesity or alcoholism and that kind of stuff. So if someone is suffering from that kind of disease, that there's this, oh, well, that's something they could have controlled. We automatically assume a lot of times that, oh, that's just poor life choices they made. Why should we be spending money on this when all of this people need to get their act together? When in fact, no, there are things that we can do to help, but it's just, they're not kind of the sexy, oh, this poor person is dying. It's, oh, that person could have just become better and they would have been cured.
Yeah, it's preventative measures, and why should that be anyone's problem, right? But all of these diseases have physical aspects, like physical bases, which is why people research them. And so it's very much possible to fix them, right? And that's where I think the stigma comes in and screws us all up. And so, okay, so other thoughts, because I don't want to keep ranting.
We ended up talking about The Band Played On, which I haven't read, but I will check out later. It was a book that was discussed previously, like back in when this group was in Upland, which is about the AIDS epidemic in the 80s. And basically talking about how, because it was taking the place, it was like AIDS was mostly being attracted in these small gay communities. At the federal level, the Reagan administration was trying to just hush it all off, right? But also there wasn't really funds to study it because, lack of interest and prejudice, so no one was studying it, there was lack of information on what was going on. And then also, local communities and local governments were very hesitant to, even impose public health safety suggestions, not having blood transfusions and certain other things. They were hesitant to do that at all because it was these gay men have been persecuted for so long, they didn't want to impose any kind of dictates on what they could do with their bodies, even though these dictates would actually be helping them. So it was these weird factors that were kind of contributing to really mismanagement of treating the disease.
Yeah, what I like that you mentioned that there's also like a self-inflicted stigma, I guess.
Yeah, it does kind of reflect, in the book, she has all this self-hatred towards herself.
Yeah, and the other main character, the boy that she's with, also, I mean, he's way more vocal about it, right? And so I don't know how much of that comes from what society has told them versus what they actually believe about their own disease, but I just keep thinking,
just fix it.
You could treat this by the end of the book. So, yes.
Okay. What I thought was interesting, you mentioned the guy that she's with, and he goes to visit his mother, right? In that he talks about sterilization of all the ones who know they have the DDG or DGD, and how they could end it in a generation. But there's still the ones who want to persist and try. But also how that same people try to keep persevering and trying to find answer to what the real problem is. We get rid of the disease if we just get rid of people. You know, get rid of the problem, and that's it. But we can. So where do you find the balance in trying to push past and cure it, or just get rid of it? I guess that's my question. And I didn't quite get an answer from the story out of that, but like, is it do you just get rid of it at whatever cost, or do you try to find an answer to what the root problem is? So I'm gonna stop there.
So I just immediately go to like current world, diseases that, like you said, are diseases that didn't exist until a while ago, or have been, come about more recently because of changes in the world and culture. And like, if I applied that to people at the moment, well, I don't think that, ethically speaking, that's the correct way to look at things. But also in the book, this is a created disease. It was something that happened from, I believe, was a cure for cancer that changed into or inflicted this upon people who took it. And so that is even more reason to do the research. If you were able to create a cure for cancer, you should be able to create a cure for this too, right? And so I don't think, at least if you were asking me the question, like you wouldn't apply that to real world, so why would you apply it to a story where they have a solution at the end? So yeah, it's a very interesting way to look at it too, though. Other thoughts? Yes.
Drug companies are reluctant to invest in medications for tropical disease, things that affect people in the third world. So poverty itself is a stigmatization. It's avoiding that allows society to avoid using it.
Sorry, I had a little trouble listening or hearing. You mentioned poverty, right? That's what you said?
Poverty is the stigma.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
That gets in the way of treating these illnesses.
Yeah. Or if an illness is perceived as being the problem of a particular marginalized group, then it's less of a real problem, right?
Well, there's no money in it.
Right. Yeah. Or there's no resources that get put behind it. Did you want to say something?
Just that in terms of they have a cure at the end, and that's great, but it's kind of a little bit like mind control, and that's why the one man at least is upset. He really likes this woman, and it turns out she's been sort of unintentionally mind controlling him. So he feels he's the one going to be mind control. So of course he's a little bit more upset about it. She gets to do the mind controlling, so she's more chill about it. So I mean, it's mind control to keep them from eating their own eyeballs, so that's good. But I mean, that was just one of the most horrible of all of the stories. That they were like chewing off their lips and stuff. So I think that's why there was at least some, not necessarily, hey, let's do it. This is great. He's gonna be mind control. That's kind of a bummer. Yeah. In a good way. Yeah.
Mind control is kind of a bummer will be the quote of the night.
Even nice mind control is still mind control.
Actually, I think that's a great way to end this. Mind control is not the best. No, thank you for that. That helps me also, understand the ending of it.
So what really is medication if not mind control? I don't know.
Okay. That's
well, that adds more nuance to it too. Like, there is the aspect of like mind control, but there's also the aspect of its pheromones. Like, it's something produced by the human body. So is it mind control? Like, it's not like 100% clear answer, which I really like.
Yeah, they definitely don't go into details about it, but from what I understood, it was something that you could eventually study and figure out what the scientific basis was eventually, and synthesize it. But the way that it was explained was not clear, and so it's up with the guy, obviously, who's already very diligent in making sure he doesn't continue with the disease or doesn't inflict it upon anyone else. It's obvious, that he would be upset with something like this for different reasons. So, yeah. Okay, Dr. Malone, do you have any ending thoughts?
Just go read more Octavia Butler, I guess.
Yeah, that's what I've gotten from this too. So, okay, great. Thank you guys so much for being here. This was my first time hosting it, so Thank you for sticking with me. It's way past what was supposed to last anyway, but I appreciate it. So next month, I believe October 26th is the next Books, Booze, and Brains, and it will be held on Zoom, and the links will be online at the Indiana Humanities website. And so hopefully we'll see you all there.
Thank you, everyone.